V. We are talking about the 1983 miniseries simply called V. So if you are familiar with things like Game of Thrones and maybe Walking Dead, these big TV phenomena that we have in these days, well, in 1983 V was the equivalent. This was a 2-episode mini-series, each episode around about an hour and a half. So they were essentially kind of movies, really. And this was a sort of a cultural event. Now, obviously, me being from the UK, we got this, but it was the buzz was kind of there in the UK as well. So I should imagine it was in America. This was an event where everyone was kind of talking about it. And initially, V was envisioned as a kind of a drama about an occupying force, essentially. And only a little bit later in kind of development was the idea that there were actually aliens as an occupying force. And this was kind of really kind of juxtaposing what's happened in things like World War II, with obviously the Nazis as an occupying force and stuff like that. So the story focuses on, it's an ensemble cast, but it ultimately focuses on in America. And we have these 50 or so massive flying saucers, and this is pre-Independence Day. It's kind of, which is sometimes compared to. So these like 50 or so huge flying saucers all appear over the kind of like the world ultimately, and no one really knows what's happening. And it's a very kind of slow unfolding drama with some kind of quite kind of like realistic depictions of kind of people and their reactions to this ultimately. And the first episode of this kind of like this mini-series, which is only 2 episodes, we'll come on to what happened in just a minute after that. The first episode is really the kind of the introduction, the kind of the people's reactions to them, or these visitors who come supposedly in peace, and people's kind of initial excitement about it, but there's a few people who maybe are somewhat sceptical. And as the story progresses into the kind of the second episode, we understand maybe more that the visitors may not be quite as benevolent as they appear to be. Now, what is the complexity of this show is that the gradient of people, both from the humans and the visitor side that you have there, you have people who are, you know, on both sides, who are very for the visitors and those who are against, and kind of varying degrees of in between. So in this show, there's not really that kind of like very much a kind of black and white, good guys, bad guys. I mean, they are there obviously, but in between these, you have all these kind of like different characters who have differing kind of opinions and stuff, and of obviously how they may change as the series kind of progresses. For example, on the visitors' side, you have obviously the main visitors are all kind of bad guys who kind of want to take over the earth ultimately, but there are visitors within that. So with any group of people, there are different opinions, and we have some that actually would have rather have come to Earth in a kind of a peaceful manner, and we have some that are simply just clueless and are just kind of visiting that, you know, and doing their job. We have Robert Englund basically, who plays a kind of very low-level alien visitor, and he's just a kind of worker, and he ultimately doesn't really know what's going on. He is just kind of working there and kind of just does what he's told. And then within the visitor hierarchy, the most kind of like famous one, I guess, is Diana, played by the lovely Jane Badler, who the Deadly Dames interviewed for the channel actually quite recently. This is why I've actually watched this miniseries, so check out that interview. And she's obviously the kind of the head bad guy, and she was the Joffrey of this season, this series. Back in 1983, the kind of like the you love to hate her types of character, but she was really fun to kind of watch. And then we have Martin, who is kind of like this sort of good guy alien. And then in the human side, obviously, we have all these kind of different people. We have collaborators, we have people who just kind of turn the blind eye, and obviously we have our kind of hero, so to speak. So no one ever really gets a huge amount of screen time in this, to be honest. I mean, I was rewatching this for doing this review, I'm thinking, man, Diana, played by Jane Badler, is hardly in it, to be honest with you. But I always think of her as being such a kind of a main character. She gets more in the kind of like the later series that came out, but in this mini-series, especially in the first episode, she's barely in it. I guess the main protagonist is Mike Donovan, played by the Beastmaster himself, Mark Singer. He's kind of the de facto hero, and Faye Grant is just kind of like the female leader of the Resistance. They are kind of your two main protagonists here. But the strength of this show is really the kind of the complex relationships and the kind of the analogies and metaphors that obviously that kind of we have in this kind of scientific setting, but obviously kind of mirror what's happening in our real world and stuff like that. So you're kind of watching it, but realise actually it's obviously things are happening. And you know, when this came out, the whole big thing was like it's like a shout out essentially to the kind of like resistance fighters, past, present and future. Now in today's climate, it's even a little bit more of political minefield, because resistance fighters is another word for terrorists. So there's a whole other kind of like conversation to be had there, and depending on obviously which side of the coin you fall on, you may see it in a slightly different way. So it's really a very kind of complex show, this. But onto the kind of the more like, jazzy stuff. I mean, for a TV budget in 1983, this really did look good. I mean, the visitors are actually reptilian, but they kind of wear like fake, you know, human-looking kind of outer shells ultimately to try and fool people. But the actual, when we see the lizard kind of makeup, at least in the mini-series, the later seasons were a little dodgy, but it looks absolutely great, and we have all these kind of fantastic sets of the kind of the interiors of these kind of like motherships and stuff like that. It looks good. I mean, the production value is equal really to a movie. I mean, there are some kind of ropey kind of like composite shots and things like that, but you know, it's a TV budget in 1983. What are you going to do? Do I have any kind of legitimate criticisms with this? I have a couple. The main one for me is a plot point here that that I think is silly even by 1983 standards, where to kind of like to cover up their tracks, basically the visitors convince the world that scientists are ultimately evil and conspiring against them, and everyone just kind of goes along with it. Literally, scientists are the bad guys. I'm thinking, come on, I mean, really? That's just a little bit hokey. And even in 1983, I thought, well, that's kind of a little silly, and I was younger then, obviously. That to me is the kind of the main plot. It's just a bit silly. There are some silly things. I mean, the action sequences in the miniseries are really not all that fantastic, and we have the most boring dogfight sequence ever. When we have shootouts and stuff, there's clearly kind of like cannon fodder that kind of stand in the way and sort of get shot. The V-troopers have worse aim than stormtroopers. And there are some sort of like some hokey conveniences where we have air vents that are like massive to walk through and things like that, and then there's a few lines of like really obvious exposition and stuff like that. But that is all minor stuff. The only real major one I have is the kind of the writing of the scientists. I thought that was a bit silly. But the performances are all great. There's some really kind of like layered, nuanced performances from the actors here. The characters are so well defined that you and there's so many of them. So considering there's barely any screen time for any one characters, and the world building and the kind of mythology is all fantastic. And now I may well touch on the kind of the other series. This was followed by V: The Final Battle, which was a year later, which was a 3-part miniseries that ultimately kind of followed on from this, and then it went on to a kind of a standard series a little later. But it kind of changed as it went on. The very kind of serious and political kind of overtones that this miniseries had kind of diminished as the kind of the other sort of seasons went on. It became more of a kind of an action show and things like that, and a bit more sort of melodrama. Some of the kind of like the cast was left. There are a lot of the returning characters. There were some plot points that weren't carried over. For example, in this miniseries, the visitors have like a kind of like a weird distorted voice, but that simply isn't in the normal series. It's just dropped, and it's not it's not mentioned again. There's family members that just seem to disappear, and there's in this season there's talk of the miniseries. There's talk of like the visitor's natural enemy, this other race that is never mentioned again after this kind of miniseries. So there's a few things that didn't quite kind of translate after this kind of miniseries. But this original one, this 1983 2-episode miniseries, is definitely worth a watch. It may seem a little bit old and cheesy to those of you who are maybe a little younger and who are unfamiliar with it, but I really do suggest checking it out because it is a real kind of milestone in kind of television, and was this cultural event that people forget about now and kind of just think of Game of Thrones and stuff like that. But this was the Game of Thrones of its time, I'm telling you. So I'll give this an 8 out of 10. I think it's a very well made mini-series. Only 2 episodes, so it's not a huge commitment. And well, we may well touch on the final battle in the series after this. We'll have to see. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.